Welcome back. Today we're going to do a quick one on Twistura's Woodnote. So Woodnote is their latest flagship set. Twistura's released a few sets I've tried. I think the major, the minor, there was the bullet style, and then this is Woodnote. And very similar to their other sets, they tend to pack in a lot of accessories. So you get 4 packs of tips, you do get a modular cable, you do get very nice shells, you do get the case. The cable is actually super nice compared to, I think, some of the previous ones. This is a very, very nice 2-core, kind of a high strand count style, copper looking cable. Very, very nice. Their shells, maybe a slight departure from their previous ones, which had the little cool window and highly polished case or shell. This one is more of an aluminum, kind of with a matte, kind of slightly shiny. It does carry a little shine there, but yeah, a little bit different than their previous sets. Definitely more like a traditional fit than their other style, the major and the minor. So really nice, but obviously what is different and unique about Woodnote is the wood diaphragm. And for those of you who want to figure out what they did, I think they probably talk about it more so on the marketing page, and I'm not going to talk about that. But tip wise, these are very close to the TRN T-tips. These are the old almost TRN turbine style tips. Those are kind of a normal silicone pair, and there's a kind of a green with a smaller bore up there. So again, as I said, they tend to pack in lots of accessories. Woodnote is really no different. The case is super nice. Inside the case, there's the other modular for the cable. And I think the what is missing, which I didn't pull out, was the nozzles. So they give you 3 nozzles. This is the standard one, which actually has the lowest ear gain. So that is the one I use. I didn't really use the other ones because they add a little bit more. But the standard was actually fine for me. And I think before we begin, I'll say I do hope that someone picked this one up on sale in the last summer sale. It's kind of surprising. It's kind of shocked me. I really like it a lot. And I would say that for those of you who are thinking about sets for the next sale period, maybe put this one in your cart. I think $180 is up there in price. And if you're not in a hurry to pick it up and you could wait, it's actually a really, really nice, unique set. There aren't that many dynamic drivers that catch my attention. And this one actually did. So I would say, yeah, if you're looking for a dynamic driver in the next sale period, put it in your cart, wait for the next sale period to happen, and we'll see what happens, later on in the fall as the promotional periods kind of kick in. But yeah, for those of you who picked it up during the last sale, congrats. I actually like this one quite a bit. So on the graph, we can kind of see this graph looks in the red is Woodnote with the standard nozzle. Not all that far from a standard looking neutral bright style set, kind of more of a long arc neutral style base curve. And then you pop in a little bit of brightness. And I'll say the way this works on Woodnote is that isn't necessarily going to be a base LED set. That is going to be more for balancing out this point, as opposed to having a really bass presence. Most of its bass presence is going to be right there. The impact and the fullness that you're going to get from the mid bass is more than the little bit of sub bass that you're going to see over Kima 2. And then they do push this 3K, a little bit more resolve. And again, those of you who are familiar with Kima 2, you'll say that's sort of one of the things that didn't really, or was kind of a nitpick on Kima 2 for a lot of people. It didn't sound as resolving as it should. So Woodnote does indeed kind of push that a little bit further. But I think, and I probably say this kind of right there, number one, and we'll start there. Woodnote is almost Kima 2's more resolving brother. Part of it is that 3K, like I said, it's just pushed up a little bit more forward. Part of it is the driver just sounds tighter, faster, cleaner, more detail. And again, I think that was one of the issues with Kima 2 was it's a very, very nice, general appealing style set, but the actual resolve of it, didn't really push any boundaries. It kind of sounded like a nice set for the price. And I agree with kind of what I said. I think other people said very similar thing. It's not a highly resolving set. So when you listen to Woodnote, it's a very, very resolving style set, kind of in this. And it comes across, and I'll keep on saying neutral bright, because even though it is closer to Kima on the graph and as it appears, it does sound a little bit brighter, more resolving, tighter, faster, cleaner. And it just leans in that style of neutral bright more so than what Kima did. And So yeah, it definitely does resemble neutral bright, but there's enough bass to carry most genres. Again, what you're going to really hear is that fill in part, that body to the mid bass. That's actually very present, and it works very, very well on Woodnote. But you really can't ignore the 3K, and I would kind of refer back to all the times that I say push it in a little bit deeper if you notice it. If it sounds very peaky at about 3K in those upper mids in the ear gain area, do push it in just a little bit. I think the fit on this one is actually a little bit better than other sets. I'm able to actually get it in a little bit deeper, and it doesn't always happen, and it just happened to work out here in a way that I think that the shell, again, I think changing the shell, and I think they probably like the D major and the D minor shells, but this one actually does fit me quite a bit better. So is the price justified, right? I said it's about $180, and I said neutral bright because this set resolves like one. It's like a single dynamic driver that sells for $180. It should be very resolving, and that's kind of what you get here. When the tuning reveals the mids, you really hope that they sound like this set. And so it's kind of high praise. I don't say that about too many dynamic drivers, especially under $200. But I will say also take that into account. I like a really nicely resolving single dynamic driver. I like a nicely executed neutral bright that isn't too leaned out. They put enough mid bass there so the mids can sound kind of full. The 3K, you got to kind of work around that. But this is my preference. This may not be your preference. This may not work with your music styles. If you are a heavy sub bass type person and you see that that's kind of flattened out, you may just kind of say this set isn't for me. That's not my preference. It doesn't align to my music library. All those things are perfectly fine. Just because I like the set, just because I like a neutral bright, I love this bass curve, that doesn't mean everyone loves it. It doesn't mean this is the greatest set of all time because I like it a lot. It just means that I like this, in particular, this style of tuning and how it works with certain styles of music, especially like rock and EDM, that can really benefit from a really tight and fast dynamic driver that has a mid-bass level that is kind of present and actually can pull details from the lower mids. All these things that don't really happen on a lot of sets actually happen on Woodnote. So it did kind of catch me by surprise, and I do actually like it quite a bit. But is there a weakness to this tuning? And I will say sounding natural is probably one of those things. And again, I think a little bit of it is the 3K. It's really hard to raise the 3K, even if you push it into your ear a little bit deeper. Sometimes it's just going to come out and sound a little bit thinner or nasally, and it's just hard to ignore it. So I'm not going to ignore it, and I'll say that is probably one of the weaknesses of it. So, and that kind of comes across in sounding natural. The depth is the same way. If you notice that 3K, it tends to flatten the stage. That's kind of what it would do here. And I think low and high volumes. I think it's harder to get this one working at low volume without a doubt. It doesn't open up at low volume. If you are a low volume listener, I would pass. It's not a set that opens up at all at low volume. If you go at high volume, you end up kind of hearing a little bit of this and a little bit of this. And again, I think there's a pretty big stretch in the middle of volume. So I don't really call that a big negative, but I'll say that on the lower end, it's really hard to appreciate what the driver can do. At the higher end, you may notice a peak or maybe get sound too big and too open, too forward. I think all of those things kind of come across on this particular set in that way. So the bass, and again, I'll say that there's two thoughts on this. I think the bass level is enough for most popular music, well above lean neutral sound and proper hitting style bass. Again, there's quite a bit of mid bass there. It is going to hit quite hard. It's something that you don't hear on lots of sets. I love this bass shelf, and this is a very, very nice version of this bass shelf. Kind of in the same way I said about Kima, that the bass shelf in this particular shape at these levels, I tend to love these style of bass sets. I love a little bit more mid bass than sub bass. I don't want to hear the sub bass rising. That's kind of exactly what you hear here. It's just a very natural, full sounding mid bass and then a sub bass that extends. It doesn't boom. It doesn't bloat. It's exactly what it should sound like on a more expensive dynamic driver. That's what you get here. So the driver is very good. I would say even 1 dB less of sub bass would carry out more resolve and into the sub bass, a little bit better stage and image better, generally evening out the resolve and improve transparency. The quality is high enough to notice. So I'll say that Kima 2, if you actually took the Woodnote's bass shelf and probably put it right where Kima 2 is. And if you look at the other nozzles, that's about where they do it. The problem with the other nozzles is they actually increase that, which I don't want to do. But this is a very, very highly resolving set, and you notice sort of where there's a 1 dB bump up here where the sub bass is sort of rising a little bit faster, a little bit too early, and the mids are kind of decaying and dropping down. The point at which the mids can carry even further back before running into the sub bass is sort of what you notice. So I would have no problem with someone saying, yeah, I just EQ'd the sub bass so it's 1 dB lower, push that back a hair, and you get more resolving mids, better imaging, all these things kind of come across. And this is just one of these drivers where you notice very, very small things like that because it's nicely resolving, kind of really nice resolution, really nice transparency to it. I don't say that about too many drivers, but this is definitely one where you sort of just immediately notice things that you haven't heard before or heard often on a single dynamic driver, and that's kind of what I'll talk about a few of these things. So the tuning is for full mids, right? Lower and upper mids, you kind of have this lower mids and upper mid is kind of, they're both sort of boosted in that way. Very difficult to pull off this style tuning, and they do a really nice job of it, but it's also why I nitpick the bass. You just notice everything because these levels are so tight and this is really tight, and there's just not a whole lot of boom or bloat to carry to kind of cover up any kind of this sloppiness. Everything is there, everything is revealed, and really, really hard to kind of pull this tuning off. Any slight level of overstep is really noticeable, and it does resolve up and down range. It resolves down into the bass and it resolves up into the upper range. This is why it sounds like a $180 set, and not many single dynamic drivers can really kick that soft DD sound without going too neutral bright. One of the few DD that has a higher level of transparency and dynamics. So typically what happens on a single dynamic driver, if you want it to sound more technical, you make it very neutral bright, right? You cut the bass level to the point where it's very neutral, there's almost no boost to it at all. That kind of reveals the mids in that way, and then you throw a bright kind of boost up there, and that brings forward all of your detail in the upper end. So the problem with that is it essentially sounds overly sharp, not enough bass, too clean, too analytical, too sharp is really what it comes down to. So to pull off this tuning where you actually have a bass shelf that sounds fine on popular music, you have a lower mid which actually fills in the lower ends of your rock and your pops. All of those actually sound right. You do have lower mid detail, and then they pop it up here, and yeah, maybe that's just a little bit too sharp, but man, the way they pulled off this balance is sort of unlike all the other Twistura sets, and I don't know who tuned this one, but it's actually quite different than the other ones. And again, they pulled off a very resolving, very technical style tuning without going too neutral, too bright, too sharp. It still has that kind of edge of naturalness to it. You know, maybe not perfect timbre, but I would say that the cons to it, or at least the benefits to what they did on this tuning, do outweigh the kind of the normal things that you kind of tend to complain about. So definitely, I probably say that somewhere right around there. So yeah, I do like the mids a lot, but there's just moments where that 3K does bother me. It sounds a little bit off natural, like I just said. In that case, I would still put it as acceptable trade-off, considering everything else it can do well. Everything else that it does that other single dynamic drivers around the same price point don't do as well as Woodnote does. So treble, and again, as you would expect from a mid-centric tuning, just enough to carry out extension is what you want. Again, the 3K is borderline too high. Sometimes it bothers me. If I were to nitpick something, the upper treble is really hard for most single dynamic drivers. This pushed just a hair too far where you notice it to get a little bit loose at the edges. If you are if you aren't really into balanced armatures, you sort of know that notes tend to have a really sharp edge all the way out to the edge, all the way out to the horizon of your hearing. You tend to notice that sharpness and that note definition on balanced armatures. Dynamic drivers, when I talk about the soft dynamic driver sound, that upper edge of the treble can sort of flake out, wobble a little bit, or just sound a little bit not as sharp, not as resolved. And in here, I think they probably pushed it just a little bit because you start to notice it. It's sort of at the level where it was noticeable. It didn't really bother me, but it sort of reared its head occasionally enough that I noticed it. And I would say much like how I talk about the sub bass is you don't want to notice it. Don't push the sub bass 1 dB or 2 dB above where it should be, where it becomes noticeable. Just pull it back 1 dB and then it's not noticeable at all. Probably the same thing in the upper treble. I would have just pulled it back 1 dB. It would have been less noticeable. It would have had a really nice natural roll off. But as the first set in the wood dynamic driver, I think they actually did a really nice job on it. And so I can nitpick it, but it's actually done pretty well. It just became noticeable occasionally. Stage and imaging, again, if that 3K affects your awareness of stage, lower it to proper dimensions and better imaging. Again, I would say the 3K, if I notice it, it tends to flatten the stage. It doesn't have enough depth as it should be. Even though there is mid-bass that should give you the depth for the stage is how I tend to perceive that. This will tend to flatten it a little bit, and this isn't more than that. So that tends to flatten it a little bit more and sort of be right at your ears or forward instead of going kind of back of the head depth, and that's what I would describe. Here, if you notice the 3K, if you don't notice the 3K, then you may actually hear it kind of improper width, height, and depth. But I would say if you notice it, then just EQ it or change your tips or do something else. But so the verdict on Twistura, I will say it's easily the best Twistura without a doubt. I would definitely recommend it, as there just aren't that many sets, single dynamic driver sets that resolve as well as Woodnote does. And again, I will say I wreck it. I will say it's a highly resolving single dynamic driver. But if that's not your thing, right? If you don't like this tuning, if you don't necessarily care about the best resolving single dynamic driver, then it doesn't really matter. The set probably isn't for you. But there are characteristics of Woodnote and this tuning that are kind of not unique, but they're done very, very well. And if those appeal to you, then yeah, I would definitely have this one in your cart for the next sale going into the fall, and we'll see what happens. But yeah, definitely a bit surprised. They definitely pulled off something much better than I thought they were going to. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.